everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's November 2019, and you're listening to episode 148, which is a discussion about the ethical questions around Christians consuming pop culture. On this episode, I'm joined by Caleb Woodbridge, who lives in Bletchley, England, and works as publishing director for InterVarsity Press UK. Caleb has written an online exclusive viewpoint article for the Christian Research Journal, and it's called Ditching Netflix, Engaging Pop Culture in the Age of Binge-Watching, and you can read it for free online at our website, equip.org. Caleb, it's good to have you on again.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be back.
Well, I'm really excited to have Caleb back on because it's been about 100 episodes since he was last on the podcast. And if you missed his other episode, which was episode 37, which was called Choose Your Own Enchantment, Freedom and Conscience in What We Watch, you'll want to go back and listen to it because it's related to today's topic. So recently online, there was this big discussion about pop culture and Christians in particular, and Netflix specifically. So can you kind of explain what the whole debate was about?
Yeah, so there seemed to be a bit of conversation kick-off over the summer about whether Christians should quit Netflix. So Matthew Lee Anderson was sort of making the case for that in his email newsletter, and on Mere Orthodoxy, Brad East wrote this article against pop culture, and he was arguing that there's always much better things that you can be doing, and there's no argument for spending time online or engaging pop culture as a better activity for Christians with time on their hands than, say, grabbing a coffee with a friend or reading a book or chatting with a neighbour. And I kind of disagree with him. I think obviously you got to keep these things in the right balance, but there's no reason that engaging pop culture can't be one part of a healthy, balanced Christian life. And in fact, there can be some excellent reasons for spending some, but of course not an excessive amount of your time on that.
Well, it was interesting because in that particular article, which was called Against Pop Culture on Mere Orthodoxy, the author Brad East had this long list. I mean, you mentioned some of the few things that he said about anything you could do that would be better than, for example, watching Netflix or anything streamed online. And it was interesting that two things he mentioned people could argue as parts of pop culture. One of those was playing a board game, and the other one was reading. And so it was very interesting because some of those things these days especially are related a lot to pop culture. So what are Brad East and Matthew Lee Anderson's concern about, Netflix in particular, and this whole idea of, quote unquote, engaging pop culture?
Yeah, I think it's kind of important to separate those two things out a bit, because there's a sort of perhaps general case for, is there a general case for engaging pop culture? And then how helpful is engaging with shows on these streaming services such as Netflix in particular? Because certainly I think books, board games, they're all forms of pop culture. And I'd agree that not all forms of pop culture are necessarily created equal. There's different mediums perhaps engage us with other people more than others. And certainly there can be a passivity and isolation, and particularly the phenomenon of binge watching can be a really unhealthy habit if you are by yourself watching episodes back to back, mindlessly consuming. No one's saying that's a great idea, I don't think, but I feel there's kind of a bit of baby and bathwater throwing. I think there's some really enjoyable shows on Netflix and ones that are interesting and that are exploring questions and that show us something about our own culture that are worth thinking about and enjoying and discussing. So it's kind of, is Netflix a more passive, less engaged form of watching? Very often, yes. And I think it's worth thinking about that and perhaps pushing back on the place that that can play in our lives as just an easy escape, passive thing that can swallow up large chunks of our time. So I think there's things to affirm in the critique, but then there's also things that perhaps need questioning or nuancing or being a bit more targeted about.
Back in 2014, the New York Times television critic James Pony Wozak wrote an article about binge watching, and he called it kind of a new genre that exists these days. And of course, now there's something like, I don't know how many hundreds, I think more than 300 television shows. It might be almost up to 500. But I thought this was interesting. He said that binge watching is immersive and it's user directed. It creates a dynamic that I call, quote unquote, the suck, that narcotic tidal feeling of getting drawn into a show and letting it wash over you for hours. Play the next episode as the default, and it's so easy. And it can even be competitive. Your friends are posting their progress hour by hour on social media. So I thought that was kind of really interesting that he called binge watching user directed. So do you think the kind of binge watching that he's talking about, that obviously that didn't exist before the days of online streaming and, Netflix or YouTube or Amazon Prime or whatever, do you think that encourages this and it's a problem, especially these kinds of platforms?
Yeah, well, I think there've long been concerns among Christians, and not just among Christians, about television as a passive media of consumption and how it can trivialize things. I mean, Neil Postman's a classic example of amusing ourselves to death, and his arguments in that television trains us to treat everything as entertainment and all of the issues that go along with that. I do think there's a new paradigm with these streaming services, with things being on demand, that does change things. But I think, interestingly, it has made television watching more like reading a novel. And a lot of these critiques could be made of reading a book and getting sucked into a book, and you're always reading the next chapter and being pulled along. And perhaps there's not so much the competitive element, but even then, I think when something really new and popular came out, I think back to when the later Harry Potter books came out and how I raced through those, racing my sister to get through the books. I think you can have something of the same thing there. So I think there can be a bit of cultural elitism in terms of treating some media as more suspect just because it's newer or more populist. Though I would say that there are ways in which books are perhaps engaging our imaginations in a more active way. They do encourage a more active participation in what's happening, whereas TV gives you more on a plate, as it were. So I think it is different. I think it is more addictive. I think there's dangers to that, but I think when you compare it to other, as it were, on-demand forms of entertainment or culture, such as novels, perhaps it's just catching up in convenience with some other things, and perhaps some concerns might be a bit overstated because of that.
Well, one thing I think that has changed in television for the most part, in terms of streaming series on Netflix and Amazon and those kinds of things versus, the traditional, in the United States anyway, network TV, ABC, NBC, and so forth, is that there's no longer the series that are 22 weeks long. In other words, before you would have to watch 22 weeks, even of something like the TV show ER that was on for more than a decade. I mean, it was 22 episodes. And now with these streaming episodes, most creators, content creators, and actors don't commit to more than 10 or 12 or maybe 13 at the most episodes. So, in some ways, I think you're actually watching less television. I mean, you're watching more if you're adding more series, but if you only watched one or two series, you might be able to watch two series in the place of one that you used to watch on network TV or something like that, because it's actually less amount of hours because they're just shorter seasons. And like you said, there's a convenience to it. Now, I understand that it's different in the way they construct TV series. You don't have to wait for a whole entire week with this cliffhanger to the next one. You're just going to the absolute next one. But I don't know that it's always bad to binge watch a shorter series over the course of, a week. Then you're done and you don't watch it again for another year or something like that.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think 200 years ago, if podcasts existed, we could have had this discussion around all these young people reading novels and binge reading novels. And there was actually, if you go back, quite a lot of moral concern about the effect that all this novel reading was having on the minds of young people. And I feel that there's a little bit of perhaps panic might be overstating it, but the same anxieties just coming round again as technology changes.
That's true. We've always had technology. I mean, reading is technology. It's just a different kind of technology. And the other thing is not just binge reading novels, because I used to do that as a child because I was not allowed to watch television. So instead of watching television, I would, binge read just hours and hours and hours and hours. But that also at the same time, that would be labeled, oh, somebody who's a bookworm. But you could also be not doing other things that you should be doing, chores or whatever, just like you could be if you were binge watching TV. And I think whatever, you're right. Whenever something else comes along, we're always, as a culture, wary of that new thing. So right now, everyone's saying social media in and of itself is evil. But remember the days when there was no social media? Well, you might not. You're too young. But back when I was growing up, it's like parents would be very concerned if someone was talking on the phone to their friend for 2 hours. And of course, hardly anyone uses phones anymore. We're all texting. But, whenever a new medium comes along, there's always concerns about it from culture. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But how does this raise questions, I would say, about Christians in general? So, just this kind of idea of, adaptation of new technologies or new deliveries of technologies, whether it's Christians or non-Christians or just our culture, right? But for Christians particularly, how does that raise questions for us? And then also want to ask you what your working definition of pop culture is in this context, because I noticed that in Brad East's article, he didn't list music as something that would be positive to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, I think although there's these repeated concerns, I do think that different media skew in different ways and they have different impacts on us. And it is important that we examine those and we examine the effects of technological change, that we're thoughtful about it and don't just accept this is the way it now is and has to be. There's many things about the way social networks are set up, the way streaming technology is offered to us that aren't necessary features, but they just happen to be the way that the technology has been evolved and set up and designed. And I think we've got lots of worthwhile questions to ask about how these technologies demand our attention and are trying to very often addict us. So the Netflix CEO said that their biggest competitor is sleep. Now, I don't think that's a very healthy attitude to have. But I think one of the key questions for Christians is thinking about, okay, well, we know that culture making is good in that it's one of the ways in which we reflect God's creativity, we express the image of God, we tell stories, we connect with one another. It's part of the cultural mandate. So in principle, it's a good thing, and the same with technology. But are specific expressions of it, are they helping us to love God more and love our neighbours? And those are key questions. How does it shape our habits? How does it shape our hearts? So I think those are really important questions. But yeah, I think one of the things with that is that stories can be a way of connecting with one another through both with the creators and their ideas and outlook and the way they explore life and different questions through the medium of story, but also connecting with other people who enjoyed the same thing. And with the media landscape now, I think there's ways in which it can do that, but also because things are so much more fragmented, because there's so many more options, it perhaps becomes more tribal about who we're connecting with. It or connect you with people who are of the same taste and tribe, but because there's so many more options, you could watch loads of television or stream loads of shows and be watching completely different things without much overlap. And that's probably been the case for a long time, but I think with all of the options available to us, it just proliferates that even further. So is it fulfilling that social, bringing us together around the campfire aspect? I think it still is to some extent, but in different ways that are worth reflecting on and examining.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Caleb Woodbridge. He has written an online exclusive Viewpoint article for the Christian Research Journal, and his article is called Ditching Netflix, Engaging Pop Culture in the Age of Binge-Watching. Viewpoint articles address relevant contemporary issues in discernment and apologetics from a particular perspective, and that perspective is usually not always shared by all Christians. So we hope that the intended result is that Christian thinking on a particular issue is stimulated and enhanced, whether or not people end up agreeing with the author. And you can read this free online Viewpoint article at our website, equip.org. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe to the Christian Research Journal. A print subscription is $33.50, and to subscribe, please visit our website, equip.org. And when you're subscribed to the Christian Research Journal, you join a team of people whose paid subscriptions help provide the resources to minister to people worldwide, specifically also that come to the website, and they are looking to be equipped. And these resources include our free online articles. But if a journal subscription is not in your budget this month, we'd like to ask you to help us out with a gift of your time by rating and reviewing the Postmodern Realities podcast. We'd actually like you to become an advocate for us. Sometimes it's just a little extra step from becoming a fan of something to actually being an advocate for something that you really enjoy. So would you please be our advocate and review and rate our podcast? You can do that by going to wherever you get your podcasts. For example, a lot of people listen to podcasts on Apple Podcasts. You can just put a star rating, which we hope is a star rating of 5 stars for us. But if you have a little bit more time and actually provide a written review, that helps us out a lot, because the more of reviews and ratings that we get, people can find our content. In addition, if you have a limited budget and would like to help us out, one way you can do that is to give us a tip. And how you would do that would be go to our website, equip.org, go to magazine, go to, in the drop-down menu, Postmodern Realities Podcast. You'll see a landing page for this episode on pop culture. And when you go to that landing page there, you'll find a link to give us a tip. Now, a tip could be something small like $3 or $5 or $10. Maybe that would be the cost of a movie or your favorite coffee drink if you drink those, or a lunch out. Maybe you'd skip those one time this week or this month and give us a tip to help us bring you all of this content completely free. So thank you for your support for us, either as a subscriber or as somebody who's going to give us a tip, or even just as important, as an advocate for the Christian Research Institute, Christian Research Journal, by being an advocate for this podcast, by rating and reviewing it. So thank you. I noticed that in their original article against pop culture, that in that long list of things that you could be doing better, Brad East didn't mention movies either. And that might be different than binge watching a television show that's 13 episodes or something like that. But I do think that in this, I think we've always had, like, what do you call it? Water cooler culture, that everybody's watching the same show. But I think it's even more magnified to some degree, television is, with social media, because you see, especially when some big series ends, like Breaking Bad. I mean, then everybody at that point is trying to binge watch 4 seasons or however many seasons it was to get caught up, because it becomes this like cultural phenomenon where everyone is going to tune into that very last season and, series ending episode kind of thing. So it does really spark conversation about things. So in light of those kinds of things that are happening around us, I think we're seeing more of it now, because it's maybe you didn't watch TV and you didn't know about something, but I would argue that you always did, because when I was not allowed to watch TV when I was little, I remember the television series Roots came out, and I was not
Mm.
allowed to watch it. And everyone, all the kids in my class, I was in elementary school, were talking about it, although I don't know if that was proper watching for elementary school kids, but I do remember we were all talking about it. So I don't know that it's any different that people don't talk about some kind of pop culture phenomenon that everyone's hearing about. Maybe they heard their parents talking about it, or some of them actually did watch Roots. But so in light of that, for Christians, what questions and biblical principles do we need to think through as we, kind of examine our pop culture habits? Are we doing it because, oh, everybody's going to watch Breaking Bad? I've never heard of it. Should I just go ahead and watch it because everyone's watching it? Or should I really watch it? What is the value of watching something?
Yeah. So I think one of the principles is whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is beautiful, reflect on these things. And Paul, when he says that, I think he primarily has the truths of the gospel in mind, that we should be reflecting on those. But I do think there's an overflow there, that goodness, beauty, and truth are found as gifts of common grace throughout human culture, and where we can find these things, it's worth enjoying and celebrating. So I think it's looking at it in the context of, are our desires being rightly ordered? Is our relationship with God in the first place then obligations to friends and family, to love our neighbours? And then does the way we watch fit in with that? Because I think, and this goes back to something I said in the Choose Your Own Enchantment thing, it's okay to watch something just for fun. You don't have to do a worldview analysis on absolutely everything, but we should be reflecting thoughtfully on our habits. But that doesn't have to be a kind of really in-depth thing. And there's a place just for rest and for enjoying stuff as part of that. But then there is the whole dimension of it as a form of listening and as a form of understanding where our culture is coming from. And I think that by seeing what's happening in pop culture and discussing it, we can perhaps think things through before we have real life discussions about things that are going on. So you can look at a scenario and you can look at perhaps what the secular attitudes are to that, and if as a Christian family or with church friends, you can sort of discuss that and go, hey, I can see what they're trying to do there and how they're trying to give this view of things and make these things seem really acceptable and normal. And that's really powerful how that comes across in the story. And just think, okay, well, perhaps if that's something that is something Christians disagree on, that goes against what the Bible teaches, then to be reflecting, how can we tell a better story? How can we see the story that the wider culture is telling, and then with equal or greater power and eloquence try and tell the story of God's purposes? So there's lots of ways in which engaging with songs or with movies or with TV shows or books or board games and looking at what's embedded in those can actually help us and support those other things in terms of how we relate to our neighbours and in terms of how we relate to God.
I like what you just mentioned, that pop culture can increase, through its stories, be a form of understanding. And I was thinking of, there's some things in pop culture like films that might be dark, but they do increase our understanding. One of the ones that came to my mind was this 2015 film. I think it was nominated for a Best Foreign Film Oscar, called The Son of Saul. And it's about the Holocaust, but it was filmed in just a different way. It's filmed kind of like in the first person. So you are the character. You're like hearing everything that they hear and like seeing through their eyes, kind of almost a VR thing. You're walking through everything. And it is very disturbing, but very powerful. And that's a form of understanding, to figure out, well, what really did happen to people? What were the moral decisions that they faced that we can talk about with others, maybe, non-Christians who might have seen that film, or other Christians, just as we consider some bigger topics. And that's why, at least with us here on this podcast, people might wonder, well, why do we cover cultural apologetic issues like this one? that should we engage with pop culture? What about this TV series or that TV series or this film or series of books? So it's something that we think is valuable because through stories being told by unbelievers, a lot of times those are things that help us think through our faith as well as be springboards to share the gospel. So what are some of the positive reasons that you can see as pop culture being worthwhile? Because of course we just talked about a lot of things that people think are negative, including binge watching and, social media and all that.
Yeah, so I think often it is really exploring questions and grappling with different ideas. And I think I didn't answer earlier the question around how you define pop culture. And I guess there's this whole idea of being popular, of it being something mass entertainment. And sometimes that can be seen as being somehow lesser than stuff than serious art. But certainly there's plenty of mindless trash out there, but I think often even in stuff that's being quite light and quite fun, often there is real questions of human significance, of what it means to be human, what it means to be a good person, what it means to live in society, that are being wrestled with through stories. And so being able to pick up on that and discuss that both with fellow Christians and with people of other beliefs, it's a good way into having really meaningful discussions. And I find that often it's a way that gets past people's defences, because if you go directly into a discussion about faith or religion, I certainly here in the UK, perhaps this is maybe less the case in some cases in America, just because the culture is different. But talking about religion can often really put people on the defensive. And whereas if you get around to the same topics of discussion through talking about a story, often that's something that people are less scared by and more willing to engage with. So I think some of the best discussions I've had about faith online have been on Doctor Who forums, and not on the sort of debate section around politics and religion, but when it's come up in the course of the stories and you've got this shared interest in that, and where it might be drawing on biblical themes or portraying the Doctor as a bit of a messiah figure, and picking up on that and talking about that has led to some really interesting back and forth where people have been a lot more open and a lot more interested to have a Christian perspective brought to bear on it.
I think I just heard you say the Doctor. So if people don't know what you mean, I think you're talking about Doctor Who. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, Doctor Who, the British sci-fi series, which I'm a big fan of. And it's a really interesting case because although it's quite secular and rationalistic, you also have this element of the Doctor as this mythic figure, and often it's drawing on explicitly Christ-like imagery and doing interesting things with that. So there's lots going on there. I could write a whole article about it, I'm sure.
Well, Caleb is going to be writing a whole article for us, and later at the end of the year, we'll revisit this topic. And if so, if you're a Doctor Who fan, or even if you're not a Doctor Who fan, although I'd say don't try to catch up on it because I think it's been going on since
over 50 years worth.
Yes, you would be drowning if you try to binge watch Doctor Who. But if you don't know what the TARDIS is, or who Doctor Who is, or even some of the controversy over the new Doctor, then you'll want to tune in and subscribe to this podcast to hear Caleb talk about it in several months. So what do you think specifically, obviously different Christians have different understandings of, engagement with pop culture, as, we can tell from the article by Brad East and, Matthew Lee Anderson and their concerns about Netflix. So what kind of, what do you think that Christians understand by that? And then also what kinds of engagement with pop culture do you think are most valuable?
Yeah. So one of the things Brad East comments on is the kind of the genre of the gospel according to ... So the gospel according to The Simpsons or to Game of Thrones or whatever. That would be a tricky one to write, I think. But there can be the tendency for Christian engagement to purely be looking for sort of spot the Messiah, spot the Christ figure. And because that's so much a part of our culture, often that is there, but it can be sometimes a bit shallow. And I think it's better when we're not just mining for sort of sermon illustrations, as it were, but actually engaging the ideas on their own terms, engaging the stories. And I'll get into this when I do the Doctor Who article, is how, although it's using Christ imagery, it's often putting quite a humanistic spin on it. It's being quite subversive in a way with it. And so really understanding at a deeper level what different creators and artists are doing and saying, and engaging with that. And then I'd say it isn't for everyone. Different people have different interests and callings, and that's good and that's fine. And there's also different seasons of life. And for me now, with two small children, I have much less free time available. And so my pop culture consumption is very constrained compared to when I was a student or just without kids in my 20s. So I think there's different times and seasons and different individual things, and each person has to weigh up what's the best things I can be doing with my time, with my leisure, that both perhaps fun and refresh me, but also have the opportunity to connect with other people and be a blessing, and to be bringing it all under the Lordship of Christ. So for some people, that might be pop culture. For some people, it might be abstaining from pop culture. But I think that's a matter of wisdom and of conscience. And there's not a one-size-fits-all rule that says that pop culture is always a worse choice. That's very much a wisdom call.
This isn't a discussion of art history or anything like that, but I was thinking of Andy Warhol, who now, all these 50 plus years later, we regard as a great contemporary artist. And at the time, he was just trying to say through his art that, we are all impacted by pop culture. It's out there. How can we say that it's something lesser or not noble of being represented in art, as opposed to in the Renaissance, portraits of various nobles? And so I think that was very interesting, because I guess the question I was going to ask you is, is pop culture, are we trying to elevate the essentially trivial? I mean, I think Warhol was saying, well, things might be trivial, but they are impacting our lives. And, are we saying, well, just pop culture is fun and it's not deep, it's not Da Vinci, it's not reading Dickens, although Dickens did publish his novels in a serialized form. Is that all that it is?
Yeah.
Just, binge watch it now.
So I think the thing is that even were it completely trivial, if it's going to be something that, I think in some ways it's a inevitable part of life to some extent in terms of our participation in contemporary life. And so whatever we're doing, we should be seeking to do it as to the Lord. And so to think about, and so in terms of engaging with pop culture, in terms of being self-reflexive as Christians about it. So I think the thing is that most Christians are going to be consuming in some form pop culture anyway. And so it's better that they do so in an engaged way, in a thoughtful way, than doing so just passively. But more positively, I do think it goes back to the goodness of human creativity and the goodness of culture, and that runs the whole gamut. And there's value in the plain and simple and straightforwardly fun, as well as in the complex. And often it's harder to do something that's more straightforward, that's clear and has a straightforward approach, than it is to do something complicated. I think of some of the worst pop cultures where it intentionally tries to be more serious and deep and just ends up being muddled. Or just not yeah, not very interesting. So I think C.S. Lewis is great in experimenting criticism and saying perhaps we should turn our assumptions around. And if there's a great mass of people that are getting something out of some cultural work, we should assume that there's something worthwhile in it, even if we can't quite see it, rather than imposing these top-down judgments of high art and low art, because all stories are helping us see with other eyes and imagine with other imaginations to some extent or other.
So, what role does pop culture, do you think, play in forming community and connection? Because one of the things that you mentioned that they criticized in their article against pop culture was that it's better to spend some time face to face with a friend. I think that was in that long list that Brad East had in his article about reading or gardening or something like that. But is there a role that pop culture plays in forming community?
Yeah, certainly. And I think this is something we can be more intentional about, is prioritizing forms of doing stuff that are more communal, watching with other people, discussing, whether that's physically together, which there've been some shows where got together with friends, watched them together, and that's been a really nice thing. And then there's lots that goes on around that in terms of having food together, sitting down, and that forms real connection. And it is like the people gathering around the campfire to share those stories, only now instead of the flickering light of the flames with being roasted over, we've got a TV screen instead. And that can be a point of connection. But I do think there does seem to be a long-term decline in sort of civil participation, in membership in clubs, in political parties, in church membership as well, in any form of social stuff that requires some kind of commitment. And I do think it is worth asking the question of whether there's more we can be getting involved with. TV isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it isn't always the best thing. And so to that extent, I would partly agree with some of the things, or at least say it's a valid question to ask. It's more there's always something better to do than stream Netflix that I'd take objection to. But I do think it's a good question to be asking, but sometimes TV watching might be a good thing to be doing. So that's the sort of nuance I'm trying to bring in, the sort of hopefully common middle ground that I think most people might agree on.
So, do you think that Christians need to be conversant with pop culture to connect with others? Because specifically, this article is why Christians should not delete Netflix and so forth. I mean, is there a danger that this being conversant, taking the time to connect with pop culture to be conversant, might push out more meaningful topics of conversation?
Yeah, I think it can be a good way of connecting, but it's not the only way. And you don't necessarily have to watch stuff in all its depths to do that. So I've actually had some interesting conversations with folks around why I don't watch Game of Thrones, because I'm generally a fantasy fan. And so people are sometimes surprised that I don't watch the show. And so then it opens up. But I've seen a couple of episodes, I've read the first book, I'm sort of familiar enough with it to be able to say, well, actually, in terms of the worldview it's putting across and some of the content and the treatment of women in particular, and the way it sort of reduces a lot of human interactions and relationships all to these power games, I don't think it's really that good or that helpful, even though there's a lot of skill in the storytelling and world building. And so for some of those reasons, I've tried it, but I don't think it's a great thing to be watching or spending time on. And that's another form of engaging, I guess, is being able to talk in meaningful ways about why we might have chosen not to do certain things. So I think that can be valid. And I think if someone wants to quit Netflix, that could be a great conversation starter too. And if you've got good reasons for it, and if you individually feel called as a Christian to do that, I don't think that's wrong. I just don't think it's something that is a rule that can be applied across the board.
I agree with you about Game of Thrones. I remember I'm a major fantasy fan, and Tolkien and Narnia and Star Wars and all that. And I remember asking somebody years before they even had a series, like, what about these books? Is this appropriate? I was looking for a book series for my teenage son at the time, and someone said, oh, no, they're totally not appropriate for a teenager. And then as I found out more about it, I was reading some reviews of it the first season, and then read a review by a feminist who was not a Christian, an atheist feminist, and they were really objecting to the treatment of women. And I just thought, you know what, this is one I just can pass right by. So I definitely never even read one of the books or saw anything with the Game of Thrones. So I missed that pop culture phenomenon. Has engaging with pop culture, though, it sounds like from your discussions about Doctor Who, or even why you didn't watch Game of Thrones, has it given you more opportunities to talk about Christianity or spirituality with people who are not Christians?
Yeah, I think it has another example that by the time this podcast is coming out, the new His Dark Materials series based on Pullman's books will be out. And I think that's a great opportunity because it is engaging directly with a particular view of faith and of God and of religion within its story. And I think that in a sense kind of gives Christians a right of reply. We can sort of talk to that and say, actually, the authority, the God that Pullman objects to and doesn't believe in, that's not really the God that Christians believe in. And so you can then sort of talk about the differences and talk about how a lot of the critique of oppressive religious structures that Pullman makes, actually we can agree with, but we sort of see the reality of what the Christian faith is being about as being quite different, and then go into what that actually is. So, yeah, I think there's lots of great opportunities that we pass up if we completely disconnect. But we need to choose our moments, choose the right things, and know when it's worth engaging or not.
I do want to tell our listeners, back when the books were very popular 15 years ago, we wrote an in-depth feature article on the Pullman, His Dark Materials, and it's called Killing God, the Propaganda of His Dark Materials. And you can read that for free online at our website, equip.org. I read those books and found them to be really quite offensive. And they did this really offensive thing about God drawing you in with a fantasy story. And so that's a way in which stories were used to promote atheism. So finally, how does like our individual conscience as Christians and our callings, how does that factor into the equation, whether we do or don't engage with pop culture at any level?
Yeah, well, I think it's that thing about what's permissible and what's beneficial and the strong and the weak. We shouldn't feel pressured into doing anything that we don't believe is right for us before God. We must always be obedient to our sense of what is right or appropriate, but it's also then not being burdened by extra biblical rules or things that don't follow directly from the principles. And so in that area, I do think we have freedom. So we're not free to ignore our own sense of what's right and wrong and what we think follows from what the Bible teaches. We have to be following God and following what we believe God is calling and prompting us to do. But where the Bible doesn't speak directly, we have freedom to think through and apply these principles within our own contexts and situations.
Well, finally, I want to end with some fun rapid fire questions for Caleb. So, Caleb, you're from England, so I need to ask you our standard UK questions. So, fish and chips or a full English breakfast?
Full English breakfast. I had one just yesterday, as it happens.
And you'll have to tell everyone, what is a full English breakfast?
Well, what I had was sausage, bacon, beans, toast, and hash browns, if you know what those are. And I didn't pay the extra for more eggs and black pudding, but I was tempted to.
Well, speaking of pop culture, what's your favorite British TV show in addition, I would say, to Doctor Who?
Let's see, that's tricky. Probably Yes Minister, if you know that. It's kind of British political comedy, very sharp wit. It's the closest to the British equivalent of The West Wing, only we did it as out and out farce.
Okay, cricket or tennis?
To be honest, sport is a real blind spot for me. I know that sport can be a great thing, but my indifference knows no bounds.
And who is your all-time favorite James Bond?
I'm not really that familiar with the older ones, so I'll have to go with Daniel Craig by default.
And who is your favorite royal?
um, I am very glad of Queen Elizabeth II. I do think it's really great for our country that she is a believer and is able to be a voice for Christian faith within the public life of the nation, especially in her Christmas speeches. Constitutional monarchy, it's the way to go, you guys.
Well, thanks, Caleb, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest has been Caleb Woodbridge, who has written an online exclusive viewpoint article for the Christian Research Journal, and his article is called Ditching Netflix, Engaging Pop Culture in the Age of Binge-Watching. And we hope that your thinking on this issue about pop culture has been stimulated and enhanced, even if you don't agree with this viewpoint. So thank you for listening. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. And please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes, and please rate and review our podcast. When you rate and review our podcast, it helps others see our content. And please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast, hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged, Hank's audio podcast. Follow Hank Off the Grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.